The Detroit Lions have made another series of roster moves, and while these decisions may not involve the biggest names on the team, they could still have a meaningful impact on several players fighting for their NFL futures. Detroit has placed running back Raheem Blackshear and wide receiver Cedric Wilson on the reserve injured list, while also making corresponding moves by signing defensive back Jason Taylor and running back Royal Williams. And for Lions fans, this is where the story becomes interesting, because the players affected were not simply distant names with no chance of making the team. According to the information surrounding these moves, both Blackshear and Wilson were competing for opportunities on the 53-man roster. For Blackshear, the path to the active roster appeared difficult, but there was still a realistic possibility that he could earn a place on the practice squad. That is what makes this situation unfortunate from a personal standpoint. A player can spend the entire offseason and training camp trying to prove that he belongs, only to see an injury change everything before the final roster decisions are made. From the team's perspective, however, the expectation was that Blackshear was more likely to be a practice squad candidate than a player who would make the initial 53-man roster. Cedric Wilson's situation appeared to carry even more intrigue. He was legitimately competing for the 5th wide receiver spot, which means his battle was directly connected to one of the most competitive areas of Detroit's roster. That injury now removes him from that immediate competition and potentially creates opportunities for other receivers to step forward. The competition at wide receiver has been one of the most interesting roster battles to watch, and every injury or transaction can change how the final picture looks. The Lions responded to the 2 reserve injured moves by bringing in Jason Taylor in the secondary and running back Royal Williams, but based on the information available, these additions are not necessarily expected to become long-term answers on the roster. The belief is that these signings are primarily about having enough healthy bodies available for the preseason finale. That is a reality of this stage of the NFL calendar. Teams sometimes need additional players simply to get through the final preseason game, especially when injuries have affected the depth chart. Once those games are over and the roster cuts begin, the situation can change very quickly, but the roster conversation does not stop there. Another major question surrounding Detroit is whether Brad Holmes could consider making trades involving players who currently find themselves near the back end of the roster. 3 names have emerged in that discussion: Luke Altmyer, Levi Onwuzurike, and Malcolm Rodriguez. And this is where Lions fans may have very different opinions, because these are not 3 identical situations. Let's start with Luke Altmyer. The quarterback position always creates strong reactions because the backup quarterback is only 1 play away from becoming extremely important. The idea of trading Altmyer would only make sense if the Lions had a clear plan for the quarterback room. If Detroit were completely confident about who would become the QB2, then perhaps moving Altmyer for a draft pick or through a player-for-player exchange could become a possibility, but there is also a strong argument for keeping him. The preference expressed in the source material is for Altmyer to win the QB2 competition rather than being moved away. And that makes sense because trading a developing quarterback without a reliable replacement plan would create another problem that Detroit would immediately need to solve. Levi Onwuzurike presents a different situation. The defensive line is loaded with talent, and that depth could make him a logical trade candidate if another team sees value in him. This would not necessarily be a reflection of poor performance. Sometimes a player becomes expendable simply because a team is strong at his position while needing help somewhere else. If the Lions had an opportunity to exchange Onwuzurike for help at quarterback, safety, or along the offensive line, that could become an interesting conversation. A player-for-player trade could potentially benefit both teams, especially if each organization has depth at a position the other team needs. Then there is Malcolm Rodriguez, a player who has built a strong connection with Lions fans. Trading Rodriguez would probably create a bigger emotional reaction than some of the other possibilities because fans appreciate what he brings to the team. At the same time, the linebacker room has continued to develop, with Devin White looking good and Derek Barnes expected to bring value when healthy. That creates competition and depth can sometimes create trade possibilities. Still, there is a strong case for keeping Rodriguez. He provides quality depth at linebacker and has shown value in coverage. Moving a dependable player simply because there are other options at the position can be risky. Injuries happen quickly in the NFL, and a team can go from having excellent depth to desperately needing another capable player in only a few weeks. So while Malcolm Rodriguez may technically be a trade candidate, that does not necessarily mean Detroit should actively look to move him. And this brings us to the biggest question surrounding all of these potential moves. What should the Lions prioritize? A trade should not happen just for the sake of making a trade. Detroit would need to receive something valuable in return, whether that means a draft asset, a player who fills a legitimate weakness, or a swap that improves the overall roster. The quarterback position and offensive line are two areas that could potentially become targets if the Lions believe they can upgrade their depth. The offensive line situation is particularly worth watching. The concerns mentioned are not about the starters or necessarily the immediate backups, but rather about the deeper portions of the unit. Miles Frazier has had a rougher start than expected, while other depth options have also shown issues. There have been concerns at the back end of the offensive line, and injuries have added another layer to the situation. Giovanni Manu has already dealt with an injury, although he was not necessarily expected to make the final roster. Larry Borom, however, is viewed as a trusted backup tackle option. That is why names such as Evan Neal have entered the conversation as potential trade targets. If Detroit sees an opportunity to add offensive line depth through a reasonable player swap, it could make sense. The same philosophy could apply to the quarterback position. Will Levis and Aiden O'Connell have been mentioned as possible names to consider, but the key question is whether either player would truly represent enough of an upgrade to justify giving up assets. The preference expressed in the source material is not to surrender even a late-round draft pick simply to make a change, especially when Joshua Dobbs or Luke Altmaier could already provide options within the organization. So right now, the Detroit Lions are facing several connected roster decisions. 2 players have been placed on reserve injured, new players have arrived to provide depth, roster battles are changing, and trade discussions continue to create questions about what Brad Holmes could do before the final team is set. The most important thing is that Detroit should not make a move simply because another team is willing to trade. Every decision has to make the roster better. And Lions fans, with all of these roster battles and possible trades now becoming part of the conversation, do you think Detroit should consider moving Luke Altmaier, Levi Onwuzurike, or Malcolm Rodriguez if the right opportunity appears? And while the trade discussion and roster decisions are important, there is another major development that should have Lions fans feeling extremely confident about one of Detroit's biggest strengths heading into the season, the wide receiver group. According to the PFF rankings mentioned in the source material, the Detroit Lions were placed at number 1 among the NFL's wide receiver groups. And when you look at the talent Detroit has assembled, it is easy to understand why this group received such a strong evaluation. Amon-Ra St. Brown remains one of the most complete receivers in football. He has become one of the most reliable and dangerous weapons in the Lions offense, capable of making plays in multiple areas of the field. Then there is Jameson Williams, whose speed and ability to attack defenses downfield and across the field give Detroit another completely different type of threat. But the depth of this group is what makes the situation even more exciting. The Lions are expecting significant things from second-year receiver Isaac Taslea. According to the source material, he caught 6 touchdowns as a rookie and did not drop a pass, although his opportunities were limited. If he takes another step forward, Detroit could have an incredibly dangerous combination at the top of the depth chart. And the wide receiver room is not the only reason the Lions' passing attack is so difficult to defend. Jahmyr Gibbs gives Detroit a major weapon out of the backfield, with a legitimate case for being considered one of the most dangerous receiving running backs in the NFL. Then there is Sam LaPorta, who adds another difficult matchup for opposing defenses. According to the PFF evaluation mentioned in the source, LaPorta has converted an impressive percentage of his contested opportunities. When you put all of these pieces together, it becomes clear why Detroit received the top spot. This is not simply about having one elite wide receiver. The Lions have multiple players who can hurt a defense in different ways. A defense may focus extra attention on St. Brown, but then Williams can attack the field with his speed. If those two are covered, Tesla could create opportunities. Gibbs can become a receiving threat from the backfield, while LaPorta can create problems at tight end. And then there are the additional depth options. Greg Dortch is another player mentioned as someone worth watching, particularly after showing some ability on special teams during the preseason. There is excitement about what he could bring when given opportunities as a wide receiver, and the expectation is that he could become a player the fan base quickly appreciates. The overall depth is what gives Detroit so much flexibility. Injuries are part of every NFL season, and having having capable players behind the starters can make an enormous difference. Even players such as Tom Kennedy have shown that they can step into a larger role when needed. The source material specifically points to his ability to contribute when called upon previously. So the Lions enter this season with a receiving group that appears deep, talented, and capable of creating problems for any opponent. And while no team can realistically have the best player at every position, having the NFL's highest ranked wide receiver group is certainly an advantage Detroit can build around. But the news does not end there. The Lions have also officially revealed their NFC North rivalry uniforms. And this is another topic that is going to create plenty of debate among fans. The design features a white uniform with blue detailing and black elements, including distinctive lines around the shoulders. The blue helmet remains part of the look, creating a combination that gives the uniform a different appearance from Detroit's more traditional designs. And the reaction described in the source material is overwhelmingly positive. The uniform was described as sleek, crisp, and clean. The combination of the blue helmet with the white uniform was seen as a strong visual match, while the blue detailing around the black elements gives the design another layer of contrast. It is clearly something different for the Lions, and that is part of what makes these rivalry uniforms interesting. Of course, not every fan will have the same reaction. Some people may prefer Detroit's traditional uniforms, while others may love seeing the team experiment with a new design. There was also a comparison made to the Carolina Panthers because of the similarities in the color combinations, which could be one of the few criticisms some fans might have. But when you have 32